He drove the same route every morning, past the Veterans Memorial, past the flag that never moved in the still hospital air, past the bench where the old men sat and pretended the war hadn't followed them home. Marcus Webb had been doing it for 7 years. He never spoke about himself, never complained, never flinched. He just drove and smiled when someone needed a smile, and held the door when someone's legs had forgotten how to carry them. Nobody at St. Ambrose Regional Medical Center thought to ask where he came from. Nobody looked closely enough to see what he was hiding beneath the long sleeves he wore even in August. Until the morning Senator Diane Holloway missed her town car, climbed into shuttle bus number 4, and sat close enough to notice the ridgeline of scars curling up from his wrist like a river on a map of somewhere terrible. Marcus Webb arrived at St. Ambrose Regional Medical Center on a Tuesday in late October 7 years ago, carrying nothing but a duffel bag, a forged-looking reference letter from a transportation company in Tucson that no one ever bothered to call, and a quietness about him so complete it felt less like shyness and more like a decision. He was hired within the hour. The hospital's shuttle coordinator, a round-faced woman named Brenda Cho, told her supervisor afterward that there was something about the man that made her feel he needed the job more than the job needed him, and she meant it as a kindness, though she couldn't have explained what she saw. Marcus was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of old wood. Dark, worn, holding something in the way old wood holds the shape of rain. He wore a long-sleeved thermal undershirt beneath his uniform polo every single day, regardless of the season, and no one ever commented on it because there were things about Marcus Webb that people instinctively understood were not to be commented upon. The shuttle route at St. Ambrose was a loop, from the east parking structure across the main boulevard to the oncology annex, then to the rehabilitation wing, then to the dialysis center on the far south end of the campus, then back. It took 11 minutes to complete, and Marcus completed it approximately 40 times per shift, 5 days a week, for 7 years. By the most conservative estimate, he had driven that loop over 70,000 times. He knew every crack in the asphalt. He knew which speed bump near the dialysis center was positioned at an angle that jolted patients with lower back injuries, and he learned to slow to nearly nothing before crossing it. He knew that the oncology patients preferred the radio off, that the rehab patients often liked to talk, not to him necessarily, but to someone, to the air, to the version of themselves they were trying to rebuild. And he knew that the dialysis patients were almost always exhausted in the particular way of people whose bodies were doing work that bodies were never designed to do 3 times a week, forever, or until they weren't. He learned names without being asked. He learned that Gerald in 4B was always the first patient of the morning and liked exactly 2 minutes of silence before he'd begin his slow, deliberate account of whatever he'd dreamed the night before. He learned that Mrs. Adayeze Okonkwo, who came every Tuesday and Thursday for dialysis, always carried a small Bible in her left hand and never opened it on the shuttle but held it the way some people hold a child's hand in the dark, not for reading, but for the fact of it. He learned that the nurses who rode the shuttle at the shift change around 7 in the morning were too tired for conversation but needed someone to nod at them when they boarded, to acknowledge that they had arrived, that they existed, that what they did mattered. Marcus nodded. Marcus always nodded. He lived in a studio apartment on Millwood Street, 12 minutes from the hospital by bus. The apartment was clean in the specific way of spaces that have been stripped of all excess. No photographs on the walls, no decorative objects, no evidence of a life lived elsewhere before this one. There was a mattress on a metal frame, a second-hand couch, a small television he used mostly for the weather. There was a shelf with 11 books, all non-fiction, most of them histories of wars he had not been present for, which is perhaps why he could read about them. There was a coffee maker and a set of 4 mugs, though Marcus never had guests. The extra mugs were from a thrift store and their number had not been deliberate. On the kitchen counter, arranged with the kind of precision that suggests either compulsion or deep habit, sat 3 orange prescription bottles. He took what was in them every morning before he left for work, washing the pills down with black coffee and looking out the one window that faced east, toward the hospital, toward the route, toward the only thing in his life that still felt most mornings like enough of a reason. No one at St. Ambrose knew where Marcus had been before Tucson. No one knew about Fort Bragg, about the 75th Ranger Regiment, about 3 deployments to places whose names felt like weather systems, hot and shifting and indifferent to whatever human meaning was projected onto them. No one knew about the IED on a road outside Kandahar that had taken 2 men from his unit and left Marcus standing in a cloud of smoke and particulate matter, physically intact in every way that showed, walking away from the wreckage with something broken so far inside him that no X-ray or MRI or careful doctor's hands could locate it precisely. No one knew about the years between Kandahar and Tucson that Marcus himself could only account for in fragments. A shelter in Phoenix, a brother's couch in Albuquerque, a VA waiting room where he sat for 4 hours and then stood up and walked out because the fluorescent lights were the exact same frequency as the lights in the room where they'd told him about his men. No one knew, and Marcus did not offer to tell them, and the long sleeves kept his arms private, and the route kept him moving, and the moving kept him, just barely, on the right side of whatever line it is that a man like Marcus Webb walks beside every day without looking down. Senator Diane Holloway was not supposed to be on Shuttle Bus number 4. She was supposed to be in a black town car arranged by her Chief of Staff, Patrick Munn, who had spent considerable energy over the past decade managing the logistics of a woman whose schedule was less a calendar than a controlled emergency. But Patrick had mixed up the pickup time by 30 minutes, a fact he would spend the better part of the following week apologizing for in increasingly elaborate ways. And when Senator Holloway emerged from the east entrance of St. Ambrose at 7:14 a.m., having just toured the oncology annex for a healthcare funding summit, she was headlining at noon. There was no town car waiting, and there was, idling at the curb with its doors open and its engine running with the patience of something that has learned patience the hard way, Shuttle Bus number 4. She almost called Patrick. She had her phone out and her thumb over his name, and then she looked at the shuttle and she looked at her watch, and she thought about the kind of politician she had told voters she was trying to be, which was the kind who did not require a town car when a shuttle bus would do, and she climbed aboard. There were 3 other passengers, an elderly man with a walker who was already asleep against the window, a young nurse in scrubs the color of sea glass who was staring at nothing with the professional vacancy of the post shift exhausted, and a middle-aged woman in a headscarf who was holding something small and dark in her left hand. Senator Holloway sat in the second row, directly behind the driver, and took out her phone to review her notes for the summit. She noticed his hands first. She noticed them because she was a person who had spent 20 years reading rooms and reading people, and something in the way Marcus Webb's hands rested on the steering wheel, not gripping it, not loosely draped, but resting with a deliberateness that looked like the end result of considerable practice, caught her peripheral attention the way anomalies always did. His hands were still, not relaxed still, practiced still, the kind of stillness that costs something. The shuttle pulled away from the curb and began its loop, and the morning light came through the windows at a low angle, the way October light does, horizontal and honest, and it fell across Marcus's forearm where his sleeve had shifted slightly, just slightly, as he turned the wheel, and Senator Diane Holloway, who had been on the Senate Veterans Affairs Subcommittee for 6 years, who had shaken the hands of more veterans than she could count, and had learned in that time to see what they often tried not to show, saw the scars. She did not gasp. She did not lean forward. She looked for 2 seconds and then looked back at her phone, because she understood that staring would be a violence of its own. But her mind was already moving, already processing, already doing the math of what those particular scars, their pattern, their age, their placement, might mean about the story of the man in front of her. She had seen burn scars from blast injuries. She had seen the marks that years of uniform sleeves, years of long-sleeved shirts in August were designed to cover. She put her phone face down on her lap. "How long have you been driving this route?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, conversational, carrying none of the authority it held in committee chambers. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. He registered her without apparent recognition, or if he recognized her, he gave no sign of it. 7 years, he said. "You like it?" A pause. The shuttle hummed over the speed bump near the dialysis center so smoothly that the sleeping man with the walker didn't stir. "I like the people," Marcus said. She wanted to ask more. She had 100 questions and the discipline to ask none of them, because the discipline was the point. She had learned that with veterans, as with anyone who has survived something, the asking is the easy part. It's the waiting that matters. It's the space you leave. She rode the rest of the loop in silence, and when she stepped off at the rehabilitation wing entrance and said, "Thank you, Marcus," reading his name from the laminated badge clipped to the sun visor, he looked at her in the rearview mirror for a moment longer than usual, with an expression she couldn't fully name but would think about for days afterward, and said, "Have a good morning, Senator." She stopped walking, turned. He was already pulling away. She stood in the pale October light and watched the shuttle disappear around the curve of the building, and she thought, he knew the whole time. He just let her be a regular person on a bus. And something about that broke her open in a way that the most moving veterans' testimony she'd heard in 6 years of subcommittee work had not. Her call came from Senator Holloway's office on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after the shuttle ride. Brenda Cho knocked on the break room door where Marcus was eating lunch, a sandwich from home, precisely halved, coffee in a paper cup, and said there was someone on the phone asking about him, and her face had a look on it that Marcus recognized as the particular anxiety of someone who doesn't know whether what's about to happen is good or bad and is waiting for him to tell her. He set down the sandwich. He picked up the phone. What Senator Holloway said, in the conversation that Marcus would replay in fragments for months afterward, was not what he expected. She did not ask him to testify. She did not tell him he was brave. She did not use any of the words that Marcus had learned, over years of brief and terrible interactions with systems that meant well, to brace himself against. What she said was this: she was working on a piece of legislation related to housing and employment support for veterans who had fallen through the gaps in existing assistance programs, and she wanted to understand what that falling through actually looked like from the inside, and she was asking, not requiring, not requesting in any official capacity, just asking whether he would be willing at some point, if he chose to talk to her about his experience, not publicly, not in a hearing room, just a conversation. Marcus was quiet for long enough that what happened next unfolded over 18 months, slowly enough that Marcus almost didn't notice it happening. The legislation Senator Holloway had referenced, the Veterans Stability and Employment Continuity Act, a name that pleased no one for its bureaucratic flatness but accurately described its contents, passed through committee after a session in which 3 veterans testified in closed hearing, one of whom was Marcus, who sat in a room that did not have fluorescent lights because Senator Holloway's staff had thought to ask, and spoke for 47 minutes about what it meant to fall through the gaps and what it had taken to climb back to something that resembled a life. He wore short sleeves, not because anyone had asked him to, not to make a statement, but because it was warm in Washington in April, and he had decided, sometime in the weeks before the trip, that the sleeves had been about hiding from himself as much as from anyone else, and that he was tired of that particular form of hiding. The bill did not fix everything. Bills don't fix everything. What it did was create a pilot program in 11 cities that linked veterans exiting transitional housing with guaranteed employment partnerships at hospital systems, transit authorities, and municipal services, places where routine mattered, where showing up mattered, where a man like Marcus could find the kind of daily purpose that medication and therapy could support but not manufacture. In St. Ambrose's home city, the program placed 31 veterans in its first year. Brenda Cho oversaw the hospital's participation in the program, which she did with the same instinct that had made her hire Marcus 7 years earlier, the instinct that recognized a person who needed a route and trusted that the route, over time, might give them back to themselves. Marcus still drove bus number 4. He would continue to drive it for several more years, until a knee injury required him to take a desk position coordinating the program's logistics, which he turned out to be extraordinarily good at because he knew every crack in the asphalt and every speed bump and every passenger who needed 2 minutes of silence before they could begin talking, and he had always understood, in the deepest part of himself, that the job of moving people carefully from one place to another was not a small thing. It had never been a small thing. It had been, for 7 years, the thing that kept him on the road, and he was not ashamed of that. He was not ashamed of the scars, or the pills on the counter, or the years he couldn't fully account for, or the fluorescent lights that still sometimes sent him backward into a room he had been trying to leave for 2 decades. He was not ashamed of any of it. He was just a man who had been seen, finally, on an ordinary October morning, by a woman who had learned to look. And he was trying, every day, to make that matter in every direction he could reach. The speed bump near the dialysis center is still there. They never fixed the angle of it. But the drivers who came after Marcus, the ones he trained, the ones who came through the program with their own long sleeves and their own careful stillnesses, they know to slow down before they reach it. He made sure of that. He made sure they knew. The slowness is not a weakness. The slowness is how you carry people without hurting them. The slowness is, in fact, the whole point.